She didn't win. She didn't even make the final. And yet the prime minister of an entire country stopped everything she was doing, walked into a stadium, and made an announcement that brought a room full of hardened journalists to tears. But what did this 20-year-old girl do that no ranking, no trophy, no statistic could explain? That's the question that stopped the entire tennis world last week. And by the end of this, you'll understand something about sport, about people, and about what it really means to win that most athletes never figure out in their entire careers. But let's go back. Not to the match. Not to the press conference. Back to something smaller. Something quieter. Because the moment this story actually began wasn't in Rome. It was in a kitchen somewhere in the Philippines years ago, when a little girl was told she was too small, too far away, and from a country that didn't produce tennis champions. Hold that thought, because it matters more than you think. The Foro Italico in Rome is not just a tennis venue. It is a cathedral. Marble statues line the walkways. The clay courts glow amber in the afternoon sun. It has hosted legends: Federer, Nadal, Celis, Graf, players whose names are carved into the mythology of the sport. When you walk through its gates, you feel the weight of history pressing down on your shoulders. Most players feel it. Most players shrink just a little. Alex Eala walked in and made it hers. Within days of arriving, something started happening that tournament veterans described as unlike anything they had seen in years. The Philippine flags, vivid blue, red, white, and gold, began appearing in the stands. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. The chant followed. Laban Alex. Fight, Alex. It echoed off the marble. It bounced through the corridors. It filled the stadium with a sound that wasn't just noise, it was identity. It was longing. It was an entire community of people who had left home screaming their own name through hers. The Italian staff didn't understand the words. But they felt it. Everyone felt it. And somewhere across Rome, in a government building filled with briefing papers and diplomatic schedules, a woman felt it too. But we'll get to her. First, you need to understand what Eala was actually doing on court, because that's what made everything else possible. She came in ranked 42 in the world. On clay, in Rome, against the deepest field in women's tennis, that number should have meant a quiet run, maybe 1 or 2 wins, a respectable exit. Instead, she walked onto court in round 1 against Magdalena Fret, ranked 45, and turned what should have been a routine match into a masterclass in mental endurance. Down 3-1 in the final set. 9 break points saved out of 10. 9. That is not a statistic. That is a person refusing over and over again, in real time, under enormous pressure, to give in. She won. The flags went wilder. The chants grew louder. Round 2. Wang Xinyu, the 31st seed. Eala had lost to her before, in Auckland, in a match that had stung. This time, straight sets. Clinical. Controlled. Personal. The revenge wasn't celebrated with fist pumps or screaming. She just looked up at the crowd, found the flags, and nodded. Like she was saying, "I told you so." Her ranking climbed to 38. And then came the draw that changed everything. Elena Rybakina. World number 2. One of the most physically dominant players on the women's tour. 6 aces across the match. 0 double faults. A serve so powerful that even the best returners in the world look slow against it. The analysts didn't debate this one. They just wrote their predicted scorelines and moved on. Eala, they said, had done wonderfully. It was time for the fairy tale to end. Nobody told Eala. The morning of the match, something shifted inside the Foro Italico. The Philippine flags had somehow multiplied overnight. The sections of the stadium where the Filipino community had gathered were now seas of color. Nurses in their hospital scrubs still on from night shifts. Caregivers who had taken the early train. Engineers, students, families who had called in every favor to get a ticket. They weren't watching a tennis match. They were watching themselves. Every time Eala stepped up to the baseline, every time she bounced the ball and looked across the net at one of the most feared players in the world, they saw their own stories. The sacrifice. The distance from home. The quiet dignity of building a life in a country that is not yours, in a language that is not yours, among people who sometimes look through you like you're not there. Eala was there. She was undeniably, visibly, brilliantly there. Now here's where the story takes a turn that nobody predicted. A black car pulled up to the Foro Italico's main entrance. Not the player's entrance. The front. The one that makes everyone stop and look. Security moved first. Then cameras. Then the whispers started spreading through the stadium like electricity. Is that, it can't be, why would she, the woman who stepped out was Giorgia Meloni, Prime Minister of Italy, the first woman ever to hold that office. A leader who had fought through decades of political warfare to reach the top of one of Europe's most complex governments. She did not attend sporting events. She did not make surprise appearances. Her schedule was a tightly guarded document. And yet here she was, walking not to a VIP box, not to a diplomatic reception, but to the front row. Courtside. She sat down, leaned forward, and watched. The match began. And what unfolded over the next hour and 32 minutes was the kind of tennis that makes you forget the score. Eala fired 13 winners in the first set alone, her highest of the season in a single set. She moved Rybakina side to side, took the ball early, and redirected pace with a precision that made the world number 2 look, at moments, uncertain. Rybakina broke her twice in the first set, and Eala broke back. They reached 4-4. Then came a rally that everyone in that stadium will remember for the rest of their lives. 12 shots. Eala moving Rybakina across the baseline, opening the court inch by inch, waiting with a patience that seemed almost supernatural. Then the short ball came. Eala stepped in. Forehand down the line. The ball kissed the baseline so perfectly it looked painted there. Break point converted. The stadium didn't just get roared. And Giorgia Meloni, sitting in the front row, grabbed the arm of the person sitting beside her. Rybakina, cold as a blade, broke straight back. The set went to a tiebreaker. The world number 2 won it 7-4. Second set, same story. Eala fell behind, clawed back, leveled at 3-3. The flags were frantic now. The chants had become something almost spiritual, less a cheer and more a heartbeat, a collective breathing, a community holding itself together through sound. Rybakina won 3 straight games. The match was over. Final score, 6-4, 6-3. Rybakina walked to the net. Eala followed. They shook hands. And then Eala did something that no highlight reel will ever fully capture. She turned to the stands, to the flags, to the people who had come from night shifts and early trains and borrowed weekends, and she just stood there. She didn't perform. She didn't wave or pump her fist. She just looked at them. And they looked back at her. And in that silence between them was an entire conversation that only they could understand. Across the stadium, in the front row, Giorgia Meloni had not moved. Her security team was ready to leave. The match was done. Protocol dictated a quick exit. She didn't move. The tournament official beside her leaned over and said something. She shook her head. She watched Eala walk toward the tunnel. And then she said something that her aide would later describe as the moment she knew everything that followed was inevitable. She said quietly, to no one in particular, "I need to meet her." The private meeting was not announced. There was no press release, no official scheduling. Eala was still processing the loss, still somewhere between the court and the locker room, when the request came through. A private suite. The Prime Minister. 5 minutes. She walked in to find Meloni standing at the window, looking out over the Foro Italico as the crowds below began to thin. She turned when she heard Eala enter. And she didn't start with pleasantries. She didn't talk about tennis. She said, "I watched you. Not just the match. I watched you when you were down. I watched you when you broke her. I watched you when you lost. And I watched your face when you looked at those people in the stands." She paused. "Who are they to you?" Eala looked at her for a moment. And then she told her. She told her about the nurses who hadn't been home in years. About the caregivers who spent their days looking after other people's families while quietly aching for their own. About the kids back in the Philippines watching on phones and laptops, dreaming of courts they'd never seen. About what it meant to be Filipino and far from home, to carry your country in your chest every single day, to never fully belong anywhere and yet to keep going. Meloni listened without interrupting. The 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 20. When Eala finally stopped talking, the Prime Minister was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to do something. I need you to trust me." What happened next broke the internet. The press room was standing room only. Journalists had been told the Prime Minister would make a brief statement. They expected political language, measured words, diplomatic distance. Meloni walked to the microphone and looked directly into the cameras. She said, "I have watched champions compete in this country for my entire life. Footballers lifting World Cups. Cyclists conquering mountains. Athletes who made Italy proud in ways I cannot fully describe." She stopped. The room was completely still. But I have never seen what I saw today. I watched a young woman from the Philippines walk into this stadium, lose to the world number 2, and somehow make an entire nation feel something. Not because of her ranking. Not because of a trophy. Because of what she represents. She looked toward where Eala was standing, just off camera. The Filipino community in Italy are not visitors. They are our nurses, our caregivers, the people who hold our families together when we cannot. They are part of this country's story, and they have never been more visible than they were in those stands today. The room was so silent you could hear the cameras. Therefore, the Italian government will establish a cultural exchange program between Italy and the Philippines. It will be funded by a grant of 500,000 euros. And it will carry the name of Alex Eala. The room erupted. Journalists who had been taking notes stopped writing. People grabbed each other's arms. Someone near the back actually gasped out loud. And in the wings, Ayala's hands covered her mouth. Her knees buckled slightly. The person next to her caught her arm. She stood there, shaking, while the room in front of her became something she had never imagined and had no framework to process. She hadn't won. She had lost. She had played beautifully and fought relentlessly and then walked off the court on the losing side. And the Prime Minister of Italy had just put her name on €500,000 and a program that would change the lives of Filipino athletes for generations. Eala walked to the microphone. The journalists rose. The applause hit her like a wave and she almost stopped walking under the weight of it. She stood at the mic, looked out at the room, and for a moment she couldn't speak. Then she said, softly, "I didn't come to Rome to make history. I came to play tennis." A few people laughed gently. She smiled through the tears. "But I leave knowing that somewhere, there's a kid in the Philippines who is going to train in Italy because of what happened this week. Not because I won. Because we showed up. Because the people in those stands showed up. And Prime Minister Meloni saw them." Her voice cracked completely on the next sentence, and she let it crack. "This is not my grant. This is for every OFW who has ever felt invisible. Every nurse who hasn't hugged their child in years. Every Filipino who left everything behind and kept going anyway." She looked directly into the camera. "We see you. Italy sees you. The world sees you now." Back in Manila, news anchors were barely holding it together on live television. In Rome, in Milan, in Florence, Filipino communities gathered in piazzas, watching the press conference on phones and laptops and small television screens. Philippine flags went up in windows. The chant of Laban Alex moved from the stadium into the streets. Maria, a Filipina nurse who had been in Italy for 8 years, stood in a piazza and told a reporter, through tears, "I have never felt this. 8 years. And today, the Prime Minister of this country said our name." By midnight, Italy loves the Philippines and the Eala effect were trending globally. Sports journalists who covered Wimbledon and Roland Garros and the US Open were writing about a third-round loss. Political commentators were writing about a tennis match. The collision of those two worlds was so rare, so unexpected, that no one had a clean category for what had just happened. Because it wasn't politics. It wasn't sport. It was something older and more human than either. It was recognition. The kind that costs nothing to give and means everything to receive. And here's the part that stays with you. Rybakina advanced. She's still in the draw. She may go deep into the tournament. She may win it. And in 10 years, if you ask a random person what they remember about the 2026 Italian Open, the vast majority will not remember who won. They will remember the flags, the chants, the front row, The press conference. The girl who lost and somehow became the story. Sport has this strange, relentless habit of measuring everything. Points, rankings, trophies, prize money, all of it building toward a scoreboard that eventually tells you who won and who didn't. But there is another kind of winning that the scoreboard was never designed to capture. It looks like a 20-year-old standing at a microphone, crying, telling the world that a grant worth €500,000 isn't hers. It sounds like Laban Alex echoing off marble statues at midnight, long after the court lights have gone out. It feels like an Italian prime minister, in a room full of cameras, saying the name of a community that had been quietly building this country for decades and had never quite heard their name said like that before. Alex Eala didn't win the Italian Open. She won something that no tournament director will ever hand you in a trophy ceremony. She won the moment when a person in power looks at people who are usually invisible and says, clearly, unmistakably, in front of the whole world, I see you. That's the Eala effect. And as she said herself, standing at that microphone in Rome, her hands trembling and her voice breaking and her eyes full of something that looked a lot like the future, it's just getting started.